The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, actually fairly complicated, just because there's a lot of stuff in it. The Fifth Amendment gives us a number of rights that deal with things if we're suspected of a crime. The Sixth Amendment deals with a bunch of things too. The Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases. And it keeps on going. It talks about a number of different rights that we have here. So let's just break this down. You can read through this yourself. And it's also on your note guide. But let's break down what these individual things. So let's start with a grand jury indictment. What is meant by a grand jury indictment is, well, an indictment means to be officially charged. That's what we mean to be indicted of a crime. It doesn't mean to be convicted or found guilty. It means to be charged with a crime. And the one thing I want to make sure is clear is there is a difference between a grand jury and a petit jury. Sometimes people hear the word jury and they say, well, I know what they do. Well, a petit jury determines guilt or innocence, but that's not what the Fifth Amendment is talking about. The Fifth Amendment is talking about a grand jury. And what a grand jury does is just simply determines if there's enough evidence to continue on with the crime. That's what they do. Okay, so the grand jury meets very, very early. Someone has been arrested of a crime. Before they can be tried, have an actual trial, they first have to be indicted or charged. And what a grand jury does is looks at the evidence that they have to determine is there enough to actually go to trial. And if they answer yes, they hand down an indictment, which is an official charge, and then the person is charged with that crime, and eventually they will get a trial. If we follow on this timeline. That's what a grand jury does. They officially indict people. That's different than a petit jury again. Later, then, the Fifth Amendment talks about double jeopardy. Well, what the double jeopardy protection does is it protects a person from being tried twice for the same crime, or being tried a second time after they have been acquitted, which means to be found guilty of a crime. That's what it's doing. So, if you are arrested, and then let's say indicted by a grand jury, then you will eventually get a trial. If you are tried and found not guilty or acquitted of that particular offense, you can never be tried again for that exact same offense. That doesn't mean you can't be tried more than once in your lifetime. It means you can't be tried more than once for a single offense in your lifetime. So if I would burn down a house today and I was arrested for arson and I was indicted and then later tried and found not guilty, I could never be tried again for burning down that one particular house. Okay? But if I commit a separate crime, I could be tried for that. Okay? Or if there's multiple offenses. If I burn down the house, and when I burned down the house, I also killed somebody inside the house, I could be tried for arson in one trial, and I could be tried for, I guess it would be manslaughter in the other trial. Or I could be combined and be tried in one trial. But those are two separate offenses, so I could have two separate trials. Double jeopardy protects us again from being tried twice for the exact same crime. The Fifth Amendment goes on to talk about being a witness against yourself. What this means is a defendant can never be forced to answer questions by police or the court. You can't be forced to incriminate yourself or to be a witness against yourself. So if police want to ask you questions, let's say you're suspected of a crime, you can refuse to answer any of those questions. What were you doing last night? You don't have to answer that question. However, you can. If you decide that you want to give your testimony, which happens quite a bit, you can. So if people ask, what were you doing last night? You say, I was, at home. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You just chose to answer those questions. And if you say something like, I was burglarizing houses, then those statements can be used against you. You had a choice not to speak. You decided you wanted to talk. And if you do talk, that evidence can be used unless those statements, those confessions were coerced. Now, coercion means those statements were forced out of you in some way. Like if I would take a club and start hitting you, and that gets you to confess, that would be a coerced confession. Or if I threaten to do violence to you, if you don't talk. That would be coercion. Or if I threaten to do violence to somebody else unless you talk, a family member or whatever, that is coercion. Okay, so if a confession is coerced, it is not usable in court. Remember the exclusionary rule? We talked about that with the Fourth Amendment. Any evidence obtained illegally is unusable in court. Well, that also applies to coerced confessions. So if you coerce a confession out of somebody, if the government does, those statements have been obtained illegally. That's testimonial evidence. It can't be used in court. If it's willfully given, then it can be used against you. Okay, so the Fifth Amendment protects you from testifying against yourself, but you can waive that, I guess. Now, here's where the Miranda Rights came in. Some of you have heard these Miranda Rights before, probably on a TV show. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. And then it talks about a lawyer, but the first part of the Miranda Rights originated from this case, Miranda versus Arizona. Ernesto Miranda was a man who, in Phoenix, Arizona, was accused of kidnapping and raping this young woman. Apparently he kidnapped this woman in a white car, he sexually assaulted her, he later released her. She was able to identify the white car and Ernesto Miranda. So were a couple of other witnesses were able to link Ernesto Miranda to that white car. So Ernesto Miranda was arrested and he was questioned. And he was questioned for 2 hours. He wasn't coerced. He wasn't threatened or beaten or tortured or anything like that. And he confessed to this rape and kidnapping. So Ernesto Miranda was tried, and in the trial, his confession was used as evidence against him, but there was other evidence. The victim themselves can identify Miranda and so on. So both physical, testimonial, and his own confession were used against him, and Miranda was convicted and sentenced to prison. Miranda later, his lawyers then challenged it, saying that Miranda did not know he didn't have to answer any questions. Essentially, he didn't know his Fifth Amendment rights, and they claimed that not knowing your rights was in itself coercion. And they challenged it, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. They said that custodial interrogations are inherently coercive, meaning that if you're in custody and being questioned by the police, that is by its nature coercion, unless you've been informed that you don't have to talk. Why is this important? Because it completely changed what police have to do. There's a lot of misconceptions about Miranda. First of all, the Supreme Court wrote those Miranda rights. These ones that I told you, they wrote them after this case. They put them actually in the majority opinion. That's why we call them the Miranda warnings. There is some misconception though. The Miranda warnings are not really always required. In fact, they're never really required, but they are oftentimes used. Here's what you need to know about the Miranda ruling. First of all, they said custodial interrogations are inherently coercive. I had a lawyer once who came in and used this formula. They said if custody plus questioning equals Miranda. If both of those factors are present, if somebody is in custody and being questioned, the Miranda rights need to be read. If they are not read, it doesn't mean that person is innocent. It just says that police lose the right to keep what you said or to use what you said against them, against you. So if somebody's in custody and being questioned and they have not read the Miranda rights, let's use an example. Let's say that police come to my house, they arrest me, they take me down to the police station, and they're asking me questions. They have not read me my Miranda rights. So I am in custody, I'm handcuffed, I'm in a cell, I'm at the police station, I'm being questioned. They asked me, what were you doing last night? And I said, I burned down a house. Okay? That statement was obtained illegally because I was in custody and being questioned and my Miranda rights were not read. But if you take away one of those other things, my Miranda rights were not required. Okay? So let's say that I am at my house and the police knock on the door and say, can we ask you some questions? And I say, sure, come on in. So we're sitting on the kitchen table and they ask, what were you doing last night? And I say, I burned down a house. All right, so I was being questioned. They had not read me my Miranda rights, but they didn't need to because I was not in custody. So that statement that I made in my kitchen, I burned down a house, was not coerced because I wasn't in custody. Or let's change the scenario. Let's say that police come to my house, they arrest me, they handcuff me, and they put me in the back of the police car. They have not read me my rights, but they're not asking me any questions. They're just driving, and I blurt out, I burned down a house last night. That statement can be used against me because even though I was in custody, I was not being questioned. Okay, so you got to look at, was the individual in custody and being questioned? And if the answer is yes, then the Miranda rights were required. Now, if they weren't read, it doesn't mean the person is innocent or goes free. It just means that those statements can't be used against them in court. Ernesto Miranda was given a second trial. You remember the double jeopardy? Wasn't a violation of double jeopardy because double jeopardy protects you from being tried twice. In this case, Miranda wanted a second trial. It would be in his benefit. Plus, the first trial ended in what's known as a mistrial. And a mistrial does not count, so it's not double jeopardy. Anyway, Ernesto Miranda was tried again. The second time, they could not use his confession, but they could still use all the other evidence they had against him, and that was enough to get a conviction. So just because the Miranda rights were not read doesn't mean that they should have been. But if they should have been, it doesn't mean that you're innocent or you get to go free or you've won on some technicality. It may be harder to get a conviction, but that doesn't mean that the government cannot. Fifth Amendment goes on to say that you cannot be deprived of your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, so some key things here, but the biggest thing is the due process. Life, liberty, or property, well, you can be deprived of all of those things. If somebody is sentenced to be executed, that's being deprived of their life. Anybody in prison is being deprived of their liberty. Property, if you pay a fine, you're being deprived of your property. So you can be deprived of life, liberty, or property. So the key question is, what is due process? Because you can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. And the best way to explain it is all the things that are required to happen must happen. All the steps established either through the Constitution or by law must occur. Okay, so and we have some of those steps already. Okay, a grand jury indictment, that's one of the steps. You can't skip that. If you skip that, that means that your due process was violated. You have the right to a trial. And unless you waive that right, that's part of your due process. So you can't be sent to prison without a grand jury indictment and later eventually a trial and you being found guilty. That's all part of the steps or rules that have been established either through the Constitution or by law. If you do get all those steps, if you have a fair trial and so on, then you can be sentenced to prison or you can be fined or you can be executed depending on your crime, but only if your due process is followed. The last right of the Fifth Amendment has nothing to do with criminal law. It says that private property cannot be taken without just compensation. Now, this is usually referred to as eminent domain. What we mean by eminent domain is the government has the right of all the land within its jurisdiction. The protection here is that if they're going to take your land, and by the way, the government can take your land even if you don't want to sell, because they have right of all land within its jurisdiction. So what the right is saying is that the property must be used for public use, and you must be justly compensated. So there's two key components here. Public use, justly compensated. Public use is simple, at least it seems like it. It means it's used by the public, or it's beneficial to the public. Okay, the public good is how the courts have recently ruled on it. So what we mean by the public good is it something that benefits all, like an airport. So let's say you have some land and the government wants to build an airport. You don't want to sell the land. The government could possibly take that land because it's for the public good. They can use it for an airport. but you have to be paid whatever that land is worth, whatever the fair market value is. So it doesn't protect us from the government taking our land. It protects us from the government taking our land for no reason or not paying us. So if it is for the public use or the public good, and you are given whatever it is worth, if they're paying $8,000 an acre, then they got to pay you $8,000 an acre. Okay, we see this for expansion of the interstate, or maybe expansions of streets within a town. As a town grows, maybe a new hospital, things like that. It's not completely uncommon to see around the Sioux Falls, Brandon area because, well, there is a lot of new construction and stuff going on. Okay, public use, justly compensated. Probably the most recent and controversial ruling on this came in 2005. This is the Kello ruling, Kello versus New London. And this is when the court said that as long as it's for the public use, or not public use, but public good, even if the public wasn't using it, it still can fall under the eminent domain. A lot of people were upset with that ruling, but nonetheless, that's what the Supreme Court ruled. That is a pretty quick summary of the Fifth Amendment.